So today's lecture is about prehistory architecture, architecture from the Stone Age. And I give it a title, To Dwell in Space and Time. We know that space and time is the two fundamental reality that make every living possible. Without space and time, we have no way to measure our existence on Earth, and let alone talking about architecture. Space and time seems so, crucial, so fundamental. It seems that it has always, as if it has always been there. There's nothing special about it. But in this lecture, I'm going to make an argument that some of the earliest monumental architecture was created precisely because of the needs to define space and time for our dwelling on Earth. Otherwise, living and the very existence of human society wouldn't be possible. So defining space and time is crucial. It's one of the fundamental tasks for architecture. And that is a major argument that I'm going to make in this lecture. So as I said, we are going to cover chronologically architectural history, but we will have a focus. I will try to showcase a fundamental issue in architectural history, a different one for each of these lectures. So architecture existed or came into existence even before human beings start constructing anything. This is a cave from Lascaux in southern France. And this is a natural cave that had been existed for tens of thousands of years. But some human scratch, human painting on the ceiling, on the wall from about 15,000 BCE to 13,000 BCE transformed this natural cave into a human dwelling. To some extent, this is architecture. Even though the cave was not created by human being, it is the human activity that transformed this natural space into a dwelling. And this, we don't have a full understanding of what kind of activity triggered them to paint these enormous animal figures. Some believe that these were religious, they were created for shamanistic practice. Some believe, they did it in order to be able to successfully hunt their game in the field. We don't really know what is the reason, but the creation of these images on the ceiling just, transformed the natural environment into something architectural. If we consider that even when the Romans built their temple with huge stone, they did not create those pieces of stone from nowhere. They have to harvest those stones from the quarry. Then it is only a difference of degree, that how much human labor went into the material world to be able to call something architecture. And in that sense, this is or at least the transformation of this cave into a human dwelling is an architectural activity. So the cave was adopted because, you know, the cave provide a safe haven for early human beings to be sheltered from the elements of weather, excuse me, but also the wild beasts. And different space were used for different activities. For example, the central hall could be used for some kind of collective activity, could be religious, could be shamanistic, and smaller tunnels could provide a more private space for human activities and storage, etc. So it is a space, but because of the ritualistic human activity, it became architectural. But obviously, this is not going to be a focus of our lecture. We will look into something that is more engaged with human activity, especially with the human social activity, as Vitruvius defined in his theory about the origin of architecture, that the invention of fire brought people together so that they live collectively and they start doing something together to create architecture. So that transformation, according to the conventional understanding of, you know, human development, happened at the threshold between Paleolithic and Neolithic age. So the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic society happened around 10,000 BCE, you know, somewhere about, you know, 12,000 years ago. Paleolithic and Neolithic were named after the major tool, the material tool that characterize the different stages in the development of human being. Before 10,000 BCE, human beings use a kind of crude stone tools, and those stone tools were created by simply striking one piece of stone against another to create uneven surfaces. So they are rather primitive. While the Neolithic age, after 10,000 BCE, stone tools were much more refined. The surfaces were created by grinding one piece of stone against another surface, sharper edges and points, and more elegant, and some of them are quite refined. So the use of more refined stone tools also allowed the human being to have a more precise control of nature. And this transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic society also coincide with the agricultural revolution. So it is somewhere around that time that human beings start to domesticate wild plants and wild animals, started agriculture, and also started animal husbandry. So with the invention of agriculture, human beings start to settle down. And so that transition, this list shows some of the key differences between Paleolithic and Neolithic society. So for the interest of time, I'm not going to read each and every item listed here, and you can always pause your video when you review the lecture after the video is posted. But I want to point out just a few things that is most relevant to the development of architecture. One thing is the settled life. So during the Neolithic society, human beings are sedentary. A sedentary life is a prerequisite for the creation of permanent architecture. The nomadic society didn't need permanent architecture because they were not tied to a place. Their life was not connected to a specific place. So there was no motivation to create permanent architecture because their life was not fixed to the land. The structured and hierarchical society for the Neolithic period is also important because that means the accumulation of wealth to those higher hierarchies. So someone might control greater wealth, great manpower to build something big. While the Paleolithic society, the society was more segmented and people were relatively more equal in terms of relationship. So no one control someone else labor or life and control large wealth to create those enormous architecture. Permanent home, and also, you know, with hierarchical society, there were the worship of great men. We have those legendary heroes from the epic period of different civilizations, and those were all, you know, favorable for the construction of great architecture, of great monument. Fixed to land also require the definition of territory. So, you know, human society needs to define, this is my community, that is your community, creating borders and creating enclosures, etc. And we will see some of the earliest architecture, they started with the definition of a enclosure, the definition of a border. And a very universal worship in Neolithic society is the fertility cult. That is worship for having more offsprings, having more children. So worshiping fertility, worshiping those symbols that represent female or male fertility, and those are quite ubiquitous among the early civilizations. And they came to us in the form of sculpture, small figurines, etc. And because of the settled life, you know, the deceased ancestors were buried in more permanent home, while previously they were not buried that way. So those ancestral tombs gradually formed the center for worship, for the you know, gathering assembly of a community who share the same ancestor. Some kind of religious center start to evolve. So all these happened at the transition from the Paleolithic to Neolithic society, which happened around 10,000 BCE. And it happened at different times in different parts of the world, but the earliest one that start to appear in the so-called Fertile Crescent, which is in today's Mesopotamia, Eastern Mediterranean, and you know, the ancient Levant, northern Egypt, you know, in that area, that shows the earliest traces of the Neolithic culture that shows all these major characteristics favorable for the creation of permanent, lasting architecture. Peter Wilson, who is a very important 20th century anthropologist, had this observation in his influential book, The Domestication of the Human Species, published in 1991. He said, quote, "The most far-reaching difference between open and domesticated societies, between Paleolithic and Neolithic societies, between hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists, is that in the former, the sense of structure and constraint is tacit and personal, whereas in the later, it is explicit and externally bounded. The source of this difference, its origin, lies in the adoption of architecture as the permanent living environment. The adoption of architecture is an acceptance of structure and constraint." So here Wilson is saying something quite interesting, as if he is saying that instead of architecture as a result of the settled life, it is architecture as a cause for the human reality to be settled. So he believed that architecture, the adoption architecture, helped to frame our conceptual existence. It is because of architecture that we start to think, to perceive, to imagine the universe as something that is structured, that is constrained, that has boundary, and that has all those kind of different architectural features. And this is a very interesting observation because it started a kind of a, it threw doubt to the cause and effect. Which one is cause? Which one is effect? We used to firmly believe it is the settled life that triggered the creation of permanent architecture. But here he is talking about something that is the opposite. That first there is permanent architecture, and then we settle down mentally as well as physically. So he made that argument explicit in the following chapters of his book. So for example, traditional wisdom stipulates that permanent settlement are byproducts of the agricultural revolution, while new findings suggest that architecture predates the Neolithic revolution of agriculture and animal husbandry. It is before human being became settled, they began to build elaborate permanent structure, and this domesticates them, changes their consciousness. The building of permanent settlements with marked boundaries and enclosed spaces, the rearranging of nature by dividing farmland, erecting stones to mark the land, amount to a cognitive revolution. So human, from that point on, began to think in terms of permanence, developing those ancestral worship, in terms of boundaries, establishing walls, the partition of rooms, and in terms of social institution, creating laws, religions, etc., and the control of future, that is planning of a city or of a urban area, etc. So if we follow Wilson's argument to observe those time-honored early symbols of human existence, they all appeared quite abstract. Why did early human being create something so abstract? It seems that there is a strong sense of creating order from chaos, creating border, defining border, and a boundary, establishing boundary from the wild nature. And all these kind of demonstrate a mental condition of what Wilson called domesticated human being. And according to him, this is due to the creation of architecture. So again, in this class, I'm going to present contrasting theories about something. And as you know, your final project is precisely to do this. So I'm not preaching just one absolute truth. I'm trying to presenting many different point of views, and it is your job to make up your mind which one to believe, which one not to believe. And as long as you show me your good understanding of these kind of different contexts for architectural history, you are successful. So we are not teaching specific material. We are trying to trigger curiosity, and most importantly, to encourage critical thinking in the lecture as well as in the writing project. So indeed, there are recent archaeological discoveries that shows permanent architecture before the agricultural revolution. A site at Göbekli Tepe from southern Turkey. And this is a site from 11,000 BCE to 8,000 BCE. So this is around the threshold of the transition. And before the fully establishment of settled life for agricultural society. So from what is remained there, it seems that the creator of the Göbekli Tepe monument are still hunter and gatherers. So there was no agricultural product discovered there. There was no street. Archaeologists discovered structures quite large, those oval structures, with the center marked with a piece of monolithic stone, T in shape. And there were also hunting traps nearby, showing that this is a hunter and gatherer society. Some structures diameter measured 10 to 30 meters and had radially arranged stone pieces that radiating from the center, and the center is marked by a T-shaped stone. And that T-shaped stones sometimes appear in a pair, and they were also decorated. So these are the center of these enormous structures, and animal figures were carved there. You might recognize a boar like animal figure, some other animal figures, and the stone had been worked out quite in a quite sophisticated way. So it is archaeology that changed our understanding of history. We used to believe permanent architecture existed only after 10,000 BCE, but when something like Göbekli Tepe was discovered, it formed people to think otherwise, to form people to think that agriculture might not be the only reason that triggered the creation of permanent architecture. So if it is not, then what is? So to some extent, it is these new discoveries in archaeology that helped to rewrite history and also inspire someone like Wilson to think deeper about the remote past. So we don't know much. We know some data, but precisely what these images and what these structures are and what were their specific function, we are not quite sure about that either. So that one is very early. Let me show you another one that is from a much later period and at the other end of the earth. And this one is from China, and it is from 5th century millennium BCE. So that is kind of 6,000 years after Göbekli Tepe, and a village named Jiangzhai. So this Jiangzhai village is from a Neolithic culture, and it shows all the traces of domesticated life. The community has a border, and that border was created by diverting a river to create a ditch, a protective moat. And then the village had organization. We can see the spatial consciousness in the creation of this community. In another word, there is a sense of planning. For example, the center is empty, probably meant for collective ritualistic activity. The surrounding house were divided into 5 groups. And each group was with a large square-shaped building surrounded by smaller circular building. So there is a pattern. There is a logic. It indicates some kind of spatial differentiation and possibly also hierarchical development with the contrast in size of these buildings. And it might also indicate different functional division for those architectural spaces. And archaeologists had also discovered that all the tombs were built outside the border. So in this archaeological map, these are the tombs, graves. They were outside, this ditch. So there is a clear sense of boundary, of spatial consciousness, and this is possible only after human being became settled and developed a sense of ties to a specific location. Now let's start looking at something in between, not as old as Göbekli Tepe, not as new as Jiangzhai in China. Well, Jiangzhai is pretty old, but in the prehistoric term, it is relatively recent. Çatalhöyük, which is also in today's Turkey, existed somewhere in between. It was occupied between 7200 BCE to 6200 BCE. So you should have read about it in your, from your textbook about this location. So I'm not going to repeat those information that you can acquire from your textbook. Rather, I'm going to point out a few things that is more kind of architecturally significant. So this place, it exemplifies the transition between a nomadic existence and a permanent settlement. between Paleolithic and Neolithic technologies and modes of production and system of belief. So in another word, if we follow Wilson's depiction about the difference between Paleolithic and Neolithic societies, then we find at Çatalhöyük, somewhere in between. It is not as well developed, a settled mentality like what Jiangzhai shows. It didn't also have the kind of a absolute structuralist and you know, as nomadic as what Göbekli Tepe shows. So it is somewhere in between. So the site, the first thing that worth noticing is that the site was layered. There are as many as 18 layers on the same site. In other words, buildings were reconstructed atop the ruins of the old. So the convention was to simply torn down the old structure, make it flat, and even simply bury the dead in the old house and then build the new house on top of it. So something quite unthinkable for a well-developed Neolithic village. But here, that was the way new architecture created. So that kind of created those uneven ground for the village, or if we want to call it a city, because that means, you know, you don't have a flat, even surface to build architecture, right? So when we think about a city, we imagine, you know, we are all on the same surface and the different buildings were planted onto that surface. But here, if the old buildings were torn down and new buildings were constructed right on top of it, that would create those uneven urban living ground, living surfaces. That seems unthinkable. Well, we thought that is unthinkable simply because we would imagine a typical city that should have street, should have square, should have an empty space on which new buildings to be built. But none of this existed at the time of Çatalhöyük. So there was no street. You simply, there wasn't something called a street that would connect different houses. So, so when we start looking at the beginning of architecture, we start to observe some of the fundamentals of human life. We need to rid ourselves of those preconceptions about city, about architecture, and start to think about the fundamentals of living. Just put yourself into the time and space of the remote past. Imagine there was no precondition, no preconception. You simply need to stay alive. And what would you do? Is the street crucial? Probably not the most crucial thing. Is a square necessary? Probably not. Is the, you know, nice even surface on which to tread, you know, a life and death matter? Probably not, right? So asking fundamental question is very important. Some of the most innovative design were created in architecture because people try to get rid of the the preconception about architecture, about city, and start thinking the fundamentals of human existence. And when we start looking at the beginning of architecture, we are facing directly at that reality. And Catalhuyuk is an example. So how are the buildings connected? There's no street. The buildings simply existed one next to the other. They all stuck together. So there's no street. It's just one house after the other, right? And so there is no like common even ground that we would call this is the surface to be filled with buildings. The dead were buried right under the new house. So the house is also the cemetery, the tomb. So that architectural categorization did not work in the beginning as well. So in the beginning of architecture, none of these preconceptions, these categories, these typologies existed, right? You can call it a house, you can call it a tomb. It is both. The courtyard double as lavatory and rubbish dump. So there are some leftover spaces, and those spaces were not a garden, obviously. And so how did people have access to their house? They went into their house through the roof. So there was no sense of an even ground. So you can just walk from the field and climb a ladder, go to the rooftop, and the rooftop were uneven anyway. So the rooftop is just like the field. It is a communication space. So you roam from the field to the rooftop. From the rooftop, you go down into your house. So there is an opening in the ceiling for each of these houses. And that opening doubled as smokestack because below it is the stove for cooking and the smoke can get out from there. So again, those architectural typology, differentiation of functions are not strictly separated here. They are shared. Each of the elements perform multiple functions as we might define in a modern architectural terms. So here we have this drawing shows the uneven roof, uneven ground of those houses, and there's no wall, but since the buildings are clustered against one another, so they have a sense of protection. The exterior walls are windowless, and the access was from the roof and through the ladder. And that opening is right above the stove, and that ladder reach the platform, which might have the cleansed skeleton of the deceased ancestors buried underneath. So at Catalhuyuk, also, it seems that all these houses are of similar size. It shows a quite egalitarian and hierarchical society, including sexual equality. We don't find super big houses or religious architecture that required a lot more manpower to construct. Nothing like that existed. It seems like religions were domesticated into each household, and there's no collective church, and all the houses are of very similar size. So, access to the house I already introduced. So the opening is also the smoke stack. The basic building technology is using timber construction to create the framework, but then use mud brick to fill the space in between. All right, so it's basically a post and lintel structural system. Right, post and lintel. This is a term referred to. You have you know, if you have two columns, you can support a beam, and that would be the basic element for erecting a structure, basically beam and column structure called post and lintel. So it's basically post and lintel. However, they use mud brick to create those solid wall to create a sense of protection, privacy, and also helped to support the beam together with the column. This is a more detailed illustration of the structure of these houses. So beams supporting the columns supporting the beams, and then using mud brick to fill in between. And those beams support rafters, and those on top of those rafters, those soft mud with straws could be paved to create a layer of insulation and then roof material. The interior walls were also plastered, and wall painting were created to highlight different area of the interior, and especially the worshiping center in the wall. So for the interior, there is always a section of the wall that is especially decorated. As I mentioned, there was no public worshiping buildings, but for each house, there is an area that might be considered religious center. And a typical arrangement of that wall is some kind of sculptural works featuring bull's head with those pointed, curving, powerful horns, and small figurines discovered on those shelves. And those figurines looks like this. So these were commonly interpreted as images for fertility worship. These goddess image that exaggerated the female features of the body were meant to expecting fertility, and also the bull with horn represent male fertility. The bull has great kind of sexual power, and the horn of the bull became a symbol of male reproductive power. So these were commonly interpreted as a typical indicator of those fertility worship, ubiquitous among early civilizations. There were also murals created on the wall, and the murals shows hunting scenes. And this one obviously tied back to the hunter and gatherer society, like those from the wall of Lascaux. There were this kind of animal figure were depicted super big, and human figures and tiny. So here at Catalhuyuk, we find the familiar image, and this is an indicator of Catalhuyuk as a settlement sandwiched in between the Paleolithic existence and the Neolithic existence. So the haunting and the gathering memory of the ancestor were still vividly exhibited in their murals. These images shows the connection with the examples before Catalhuyuk. It seems that they also ritually repaint their interior, maybe annually, maybe even monthly, because some of the walls had been whitewashed up to 700 times. Seems that they constantly redress their interior for what purpose, for whatever unclear purposes. So from Catalhuyuk, also one of the earliest kind of map had been discovered, and it shows quite abstract patterns, but could be interpreted as the depiction of the community with houses next to one another, and even, you know, the columns, the post and lintel wooden elements were depicted, if you will, if you want to interpret this that way. And some scholars believe that this strange pattern in the background is depicting the volcano that create obsidian stone. Those obsidian stones is a glassy stone. For Neolithic people, these are the best material to create arrowhead and to create a blade. They are very valuable. The economic backbone for Catalhuyuk is this obsidian. They had access to obsidian, and they did trade with neighboring societies that brought wealth and prosperity to Catalhuyuk. So some scholars believe this is a depiction of a volcano. But of course, no one knows for sure, and there were equal number of people who believe this might not be a depiction of a volcano, and there's no certainty about whether this is a depiction of their house either, because obviously their house, in their community, there was no street, but why there are these kind of leftover space in between these cell-like units. And this, to be honest, looks more like an animal hide to me than a volcano, especially if you look at the bottom here and the similarity between the bottom and the top. So there are, again, when we are looking at history, you have to find more sources. If you just rely on one source, you probably are only listening to the partial story. And that is one of the purposes for our final project. Our final writing project is precisely asking you to do research on different voices on the very same building. Next example I want to show you is slightly newer than Catalhuyuk. It's called the Hierarchical. Hierarchical is in the island of Cyprus. Cyprus is in between Turkey and Greece. The island is today it's divided still. In the northern part, Turkish occupation, and the southern part were occupied by the Greek people. So it's like the Cold War Berlin. It's still a divided country and divided city. But there, some of the earliest Neolithic settlement had been discovered. Hierarchical was from 6000 BCE. It is a much smaller community compared to Catalhuyuk. But here we find something interesting. We find a road. Remember, Catalhuyuk, there was no road, but here we have a road, and we have a paved road that is elevated from the ground. Archaeologists believe the invention of a paved road was accidental because this wall was actually originally a defensive wall, but eventually, you know, it was when buildings start to appear on both sides of the protective wall, and since the access to the house is from the roof, then the protective wall simply became a road. It's just natural, right? Just like at Çatalhöyük, there's no way to differentiate a tomb from a sleeping bed. There's no way to differentiate the skylight from the smokestack. I think it is just fair to not be able to differentiate a protective wall from a connecting road. And all these categories only were invented after the facts, after the reality being established. So this is what it looked like, right? So here we have this kind of paved road and houses were circular, but here the material is different. It used kind of Cyclopean wall. This is called Cyclopean wall, meaning the stone for the construction of the walls are huge, and those stones create a very thick wall, and those big stones were used to construct the frame, and then in between the two layers of stone, those dirt and debris were filled, and sand, pebbles were filled in to stabilize the wall, to create those kind of very thick wall. And they are circular in shape. So at some parts, the paved road even branch out to connect those houses. So you can understand this as something to, to walk without a ladder. So if you get down from the wall and you need to climb up to the roof anyway, so why not just make a connection like that? So the picture shows the appearance of those Cyclopean walls. Huge stones create the framework and debris to be filled to form the main body of the wall, right? So at Hierarchical, there were windows, and also in some later examples, there were also doors being created that is connected to the ground. So Hierarchical represent a site that transition was being made. Roof access gradually was replaced by ground access to the interior, and those protective walls gradually being transformed into a paved road. So these are architecture in the formative stage. And finally, we have the Sakara Bray as the last residential example from Scotland. Scotland, in the island of Orkney, the northern tip of the British Isle, there was a compact organism formed by stone architecture. Some 8 separate stone houses were discovered. And here, unmistakably, there are streets, there are alleys, and the access to the interior were from the ground. So the house still looks as compact, as sticking to one another as Çatalhöyük, but there are space in between, and these spaces were not accidental. They were well designed because it created a network connecting with the entrance to each interior. So in this example, it is safe to say that wall, roof, entrance, street, and these different architectural elements were fully developed and fully differentiated. So here, this is what it looks like. It is also discovered by accident. For many thousand years, people just thought it was a hill, but then there was a storm and peeled off the topsoil and revealed some of the stone structure, and archaeologists came to discover here a Neolithic age settlement. So they used these stones to create walls, and also in between the layers of stone surfaces, there are dirt to fill. So it's also a kind of Cyclopean wall technology. But the stone at Sakara Bray are much more regular. The site had the nice brick-sized loose stone. So this almost looks like a man-made brick, but they are natural. They just produce this kind of regular slate-like stone. And they were ideal to make shelf and to make interior furniture as well. But these are dry masonry, right? So when we call dry masonry, we refer to the masonry technology without the use of mortar. So there's no glue, no cement, no plaster to glue the stone together. They were all just stabilized with their own weight. The interior, there's also a good differentiation of spaces. There's a central hearth. So in this case, the smokestack does not need to be the entrance anymore. So it could be located in the center of the house. At Katahuyuk, those skylight, slash smoke opening are usually next to a wall so that you can safely put a ladder there. But here, the entrance is from the ground, so the hearth is in the middle. So a logical interpretation is that in the ceiling, the smokestack is also in the middle. Of course, all those ceilings are gone. They didn't leave any archaeological trace, but this is a logical interpretation, of course. The roof could be made with animal hide on whalebone rafters because large amount of whalebones were discovered there. So if that is the case, the roof could also be domical because could be a dome because the whalebones are curved and was capable of creating those kind of sloping roofs to shed water better than a flat roof. So, from the cave at Lascaux to Sakara Bray, we observe architecture gradually take shape in the domestic domain. It is like the development of a human embryo. From just one fertilized egg, the cells start to multiply. And at first, it's just one cell, and gradually you can observe here, the heart is beating there, the eye is developing, but it all developed from just one cell. So architecture is almost like that way. In the beginning, there is no door, there's no street, there's no difference between roof and wall, and gradually start to take shape. And we start to form our standardized concept about architecture. So I'm going to give you a 5 minutes break